Welcome to Will I Ever Learn Chinese? I'm Jeanette Seikel. In this episode, I look at my learning approach at the advanced stage, fully curating my own learning methods and freestyling it in style. I was now becoming a more comfortable and confident speaker of Chinese. Even though there are, of course, many people speaking Chinese as a second language, there are not that many, and people's reaction when you speak their language is great. At one meetup, most people had left already, and we were a group of 4 Westerners left at the table. We were in the middle of an interesting conversation, so kept going. All 4 of us spoke okay Chinese at the time, so we spoke mainly in Chinese, with the occasional English word thrown in. I did not really notice my surroundings much, but as I was looking up, I saw a couple who had been sitting at the neighboring table, giving us a curious glance. I'm not sure they were aware we were speaking Chinese. Maybe they had seen the note on the table indicating that we were a meetup group. But they were clearly wondering what on earth was going on. I have often enjoyed this when learning languages. When I was studying Finnish, I was going to a restaurant with a friend who was a half Finn and who was studying on the same program as me, just to speak Finnish together. Looking at people's reactions, trying to figure out what language we were speaking. What I enjoyed even more, though, was suddenly hearing a language I knew being spoken by people around who were not aware of anyone speaking their language. If you're naturally curious, I much advise you to learn a language just for this reason. For example, I was once sitting in an internet cafe in La Paz, Bolivia. This was in the early 2000s when internet cafes were a relatively new thing, and when this was one of the only ways to keep in contact with people back home. I had been in Bolivia for a few weeks at the time doing fieldwork on Mosa 10 and working through the ins and outs of the grammar. I was in La Paz and I gladly spent some hours in an internet cafe contacting my friends back home. My brain was full of Spanish and Mosa 10 at the time, the languages I was using daily. When I was at that internet cafe, I had just been working all day and I was looking forward to a little bit of time to myself. But I had a treat in store that I hadn't expected. There was a Swedish girl at the internet cafe, and this was in a very small room with maybe 10 computers. She was using a very new method at the time, namely talking via a messaging platform. She was speaking to a friend back in Sweden, and she was retelling in great detail the affair she had just had with a guy she had met in La Paz. I learned how they had met and how they were now seeing each other. I understood every word. I don't think she had been expecting anyone to understand. At this stage, she was way too far into the story for me to reveal that I was understanding what she was saying, so I tried to concentrate on my email and do my own thing. But she was telling her story very loudly and I could not help but listen in. I really had to hold back a laugh a fair few times, but once laughing out loud when she had said something particularly outrageous. She gave me a glance and I acted as if I was reading something very funny in my email, laughing again to show that this was not her story I had been laughing about. Phew, I had just about gotten away with it. That had been close. The reactions I was now getting from speakers of Chinese were also excellent, and quite often people were just extremely surprised that somebody would be able to speak Chinese. I have to say that most of the reactions were extremely positive, but I shall be talking much more about this when I talk about my experiences while in China. At this point, I want to discuss the materials and the learning methods I was using at the advanced level. There is a point in language learning where using specific programs no longer really works. Because once I had reached the end of my regular learning programs and had used a few other textbooks and other methods, I found that I wasn't really learning that much new. From the upper intermediate level on, I had to branch out quite a lot and set my own learning methods. And for Chinese, of course, there are so many methods. There is so much. I found it almost impossible to have an overview of all of it, let alone try everything. This can be quite confusing, but at the same time extremely freeing, as it allowed me to choose exactly what I wanted and enjoy it. I was doing fun things, and I was doing useful things, and it kept me motivated all the way through. I started using more and more real language materials, and I started to consume the language in its own real setting. Again, I was trying to find things I was interested in, such as music, television, literature, podcasts, video, social media, and so on. Some of the things, like watching Chinese dramas, I could now do without subtitles, and I could do this without great difficulty. I was also listening to Chinese music and tried to understand the lyrics. Sometimes the pieces were quite poetic and very difficult to understand, even when I had found the lyrics online. But at other times I could listen to a song and understand the lyrics almost immediately without looking anything up, just by listening to the song. I started to compile lists of songs on my music streaming platform that had easy to understand lyrics, and I learned those off by heart, so I could sing along. I also soon found bands I really liked, but many of their lyrics were quite convoluted. So I made further lists of songs that I really liked, and then gradually looked up their lyrics, trying to sing along with them and learning the difficult words alongside. My go-to music in everyday life was now in Chinese. So passengers in my car or guests at home were listening to this, whether they wanted to or not. But many actually quite liked the Chinese tunes and the bands I had found. And I felt like I was advertising some excellent Chinese content. Something interesting happened. When watching movies or dramas, I noticed that I could now play number games on my phone at the same time, while still focusing on the contents. I had previously enjoyed doing this when watching television, and now my Chinese understanding was so okay that I could actually do this alongside. And there was a point, all of a sudden, where Chinese just clicked. It seemed to be from one day to the other. One day, I realized that actors had different accents. And I realized that an actor that I had seen in a drama before, where he had been speaking with a fairly standard Putonghua accent, must have been dubbed over, because he was now speaking in a very non-standard and heavily accented Chinese that seemed to come to him much more naturally. I also noticed tiny differences in the language between the actors. I realized that I could switch between Taiwanese and mainland China dramas more easily without being thrown by the differences in accent. All of a sudden, I understood pretty much everything that was said. I could set myself tasks, such as see where a certain word is used, such as le. When is le used in context? And then I could go and just listen to the speech of the actors and find every single instance of this word. I also realized that some expressions that I had read about, but at the time thought were very rarely used, were actually quite common. I had just not understood them in context before. So once I had crossed this line, I had gotten over the hurdle. Chinese was just there in front of me, and I understood it. At this stage, outright language learning was turning into the consumption of information, like scrolling through websites and watching television. It became leisure. It was just in Chinese. Everything was in Chinese. And yet again, this was another part of immersion. I was surrounding myself by Chinese every day and getting more and more used to the language and much better at speaking the language. I started to watch videos on Chinese social media platforms. I found some content providers whose short videos I really enjoyed. For example, there were some travel videos from all around China, and I also found an older gentleman telling humorous wise words. Sometimes I had to look up words in the dictionary, but I could generally watch this content without greater difficulty. I also found some linguistics-specific content that I started to consume, such as lecture recording of linguistics lectures at Chinese universities. There were podcasts discussing language issues and the like. I saw colleagues advertising a new textbook in linguistic typology, so one of the areas of linguistics that I had worked on during my PhD, and this was written entirely in Chinese. There was information on how to purchase the book, so I wrote to the publisher in Chinese, inquiring if I would be able to purchase the book. This was a rather complicated process, and the price of the book was surpassed many times by the bank transferal fee and the shipping costs, as sadly there seemed to be no other way to do this. But when the book finally arrived, I read it with great interest. You would think a highly specialized linguistics book is not so good for your typical language learner. But for me it was great, because I understood the topic so well already, so reading the book, I could make out what was talked about in the context, and I could learn relevant linguistics terminology along the way. I greatly enjoyed examples and viewpoints that I had not come across before elsewhere, and I really cherished reading the book in this way. Eventually, later on, Chinese became part of my work, and I ended up buying a lot, and I say a lot, way too many Chinese linguistics books. But that is for a later episode.